The last project was actually very, very close to the sort of thing that I was imagining when we first designed the class. This was not. This next group found a very different direction to go, and it's been very interesting to see how you can take this notion of being connected with someone at a distance and riff on that.
Yeah.
So, please.
Okay, so I guess what we were aiming for with this project is, I think, less an approaching a finished prototype that might be ready for market, and more an exploration of what it means to be present with somebody in a space, which is a lot of what we talked about in the beginning of this course. You know, like, what does it mean to feel that you're present with someone? What does it mean to feel connected with someone even when they're not there with you immediately?
So part of this started out with thinking about what is presence. We're very used to sort of more traditional paradigms of telepresence with Skype, thinking about video and audio that's very much about the human face and like shoulders up and spoken words rather than, for instance, ambient noise. This is thinking about what is presence and what, next slide, how do we feel that we are not alone? Like, what is the sensory experience of that versus just sort of the communication that is very directed in that sort of Skype paradigm? So what is the like sensory experience of feeling touch or heat or pressure, of hearing ambient noises, not just spoken words that are directed at you? Do you feel ambient temperature or versus a human body's temperature? Do you feel wind against your skin when they move around you? Is there smell, because olfactory senses are a really evocative part of the sensory experience. So getting at what are those sensory experiences, and then sort of a lot of the projects that came out of this were conceptually how can we take those sensory experiences and isolate the components into the smallest pieces that we can recreate, because sort of presence is a very complex experience. How can we break it down?
So basically, as we have kind of been approaching this whole time, we're trying to push the boundaries of remote presence beyond voice, beyond a face on a screen, and bring those experiences more into the physical realm. So, like Emma just said, we're isolating those experiences and we're making them into small artifacts that we imagine maybe a user might be able to interact with at some kind of curated event or a museum or an exhibition, and get people thinking about what it is to be remotely present with someone in their physical space when you are not actually there.
And sort of conceptually, it's like the other side to something like the Beam++, which is getting at motion within a space, interacting with the space, getting that video, that sound. What are the other ways that like more fully flesh out that idea of presence?
So I think a lot of, at least personally my project, there are certain mechanical austerities to these artifacts that aim to recreate very human, personal experiences that we all have connections with and associations, but still, it's impossible to ignore the fact that these are inanimate objects, and that, you know, mine has tons of gears and there's wires everywhere, and I think that kind of disconnect is what we're aiming to examine in our artifacts. And kind of how machinery sometimes fails to reach what a human being can provide in the realm of presence.
Sort of both an exercise in trying to, as accurately as possible, simulate a human experience, but also in some ways the formal language is getting at how far we fail to do that because human experience is so much more subjective. Go to the next slide. A big part of this was also sort of realizing that the way in which you project associations onto an object, onto an experience, is actually a much larger part of whether or not it communicates with you. If you consider any sort of sensory experience as something that was sent to you by someone you care about, that association is actually far more important than a lot of the technical aspects of what you're experiencing. And those projections and that willing suspension of disbelief in which you associate this interaction, which is maybe very mechanical, it's maybe just sort of evoking an emotional experience, that reliance upon sort of the emotional connection is far greater a part of how these objects get at that idea of human experience. Next slide. This is also just sort of a commentary as we kept thinking about telepresence, that it was about specificity, and that's part of why we're going to very small component parts of experiences. Like the more specific something, for instance, your project gets into breath as a very specific experience. Mine gets into heat and wear on the body. Your touch it, and you guys can also talk about yours. Memory and that idea of like projecting an association onto something to sort of evoke a memory. For instance, the olfactory system is very much evokes memories. And context. Do you believe that someone is sending this to you, or is it divorced from any sort of human meaning?
So, kind of our first step in this process, because it was so much based off of the experiences of real people, is we went in and we did a lot of user research. We talked to people and we examined how relationships persist even when they're forced to go on remotely. So we looked at, of course, long distance relationships, but also familial relationships, friendships when people go to college or move away, and we kind of asked people, we split them up, the questions based on who we were asking. So, for example, when we were asking people about familiar relationships, we asked what kind of are some olfactory or sensory experiences that might evoke a family tradition, something that people do over a holiday. Maybe they smell a certain smell, or the light comes through the window a certain way. So kind of trying to figure out what, like Emma was saying, what experiences that might be divorced from their original context, how they might be reinterpreted to evoke a memory and to make us feel even for a second that somebody's present with us through nostalgia or some kind of association. Okay, so now on to the specifics.
Actually, do you want Sarah to go first?
Oh, right. No,
We
you
already
should.
have it, yeah, so.
I can flip
I'm gonna
slides.
No,
No? Okay.
Sarah's gonna go
yeah,
first.
you're go first.
Okay, yeah, so, I explored telepresence through, pressure sensors. I guess, like, I had a specific, goal in mind at the beginning, which a vision of, a rug, which involved, a pressure sensor matrix and, the output as thermochromic, pigment, reacting to specific inputs from a pressure sensor matrix. And so I first learned how to make these pressure sensors.
Wait, so what would that mean? What would have...
Oh yeah, so then the vision was a large rug, eventually like a large rug where potentially one person could see where another person was on that rug in based on like color changing fabric, which is what these red samples are. So then I guess like it narrowed down as I realized the technical issues with that I faced. So I guess like I've started off with learning how to make pressure sensor matrices, and then soon discovered that would pose a problem given the amount of inputs on the Arduino. So right now I have this setup which has one pressure sensor hooked up to this pad, which has heating yarn on it, and ideally is going to heat up when I press the pressure sensor and change this. I certainly sort of. Doesn't I have a video? Sorry. Okay, well I'm gonna move on because my next iteration for tomorrow is going to be 4 pressure sensor inputs, and they're going to change the colors of 4 thermochromic spots on this. And
Should we look at the video?
yes, please. Video or pictures. Okay, I guess it's just pictures. But yeah, sorry. I guess it's just pictures.
Do we want to plug that one in?
Yeah, we can.
What are the odds? Oh, we're good. Did not expect that. Every Mac seems to have its own special connector. Yay.
This is my visual, and I'm not quite sure what's happening because this is set
You
up.
have 1% power too, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
I think that's all I need.
What
This
kind
is
of
the
charger?
image that I have. But yeah, I guess like that's one of the frustrating things about this project is like facing things like this where I don't know, this is like set up the same way, same code and like just not working.
Arduino will just have days where it's like it's too moist. It doesn't like the humidity and it just refuses to work.
Pee Wee Herman. Sorry.
Yeah, I was like,
Come on.
that's an interesting thing to have on Wikipedia.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
He was in Cheech and Chong.
Up in smoke.
So could you tell us, since we can't see it happening
Yeah,
right now,
yeah.
how quickly does the ink change from the color it is now to a lighter color and back again?
It changes very quickly to a different color.
Okay.
But then the problem I was coming across was like how slowly it would change back, because it stays for a long time.
Okay.
And so I was just, I guess, like taking a cold thing and putting it on.
To me, that feels like it's not a bug, it's a feature thing. Like, especially to me that just changes like kind of like what context it makes the most sense in. Like
Footprints in
maybe
the sand.
yeah, maybe it's like this is a way you install this in like Boston's least trodden subway station as a way of encouraging more people to go or something. And it's like, you know, I think it's really interesting that it changes quickly but then lingers. I think that's kind of maybe more similar to like what like meeting someone is like all of a sudden it's like a lot changes, and or you know, I don't know, maybe it depends on what kind of a person you are. Maybe you forget people really quickly, but to me that has personality. I'm attracted to that.
Yeah, I also think like if you do like share a bed with someone, the heat stays even when they get up. So it's sort of the same sort of concept of somewhere to get up before you, and then you were to reach over, it'd still be warm. The color would still be there.
I'm wondering, just in the interest of time, if maybe we should present all of them, and we can kind of have a group discussion, and then, like I said, tomorrow we can follow up with more in-depth, and maybe we'll have a chance to kind of experience it. Emma, do you want to?
Well, it's Moonbot next.
Okay, so the human interaction I was exploring is, as the title would suggest, spooting. So I called my creation the Spoodbot, and the goal of this was to recreate the sensory experience of like having contact across the back, and then also of having intermittent breath-like bursts to the back of the neck. So next slide, please. So initially, when I conceptualized this, it seemed like the breathing would be a very easy thing to do, but it turned out that became my #1 challenge, because I guess it became more and more apparent throughout the process that something that is so simple and second nature to humans is actually incredibly difficult to recreate mechanically. So first, let me discuss kind of the paradoxes that this machine presents. So there are 2 main components. One that's very mechanical. I guess I can hold up the real life version as well. So this like very mechanical part is what is responsible for the breathing. So instead of like nice human lungs, we have this behemoth. So basically, these are 3D printed pieces. This is a rack and pinion structure and a track for it. Then these are secured down with bent acrylic pieces. and there's a continuous rotation servo motor that's secured down to the base structure, and then code that has it rotating back and forth. So the number one issue that it turned out exists with breathing is that the force required to pull the syringe to create bursts of breath is incredibly high. I'm presuming because a vacuum is created every time the syringe is pumped. There were other iterations that were considered. A fan was an option, but I didn't like that because I didn't want there to be a whirring mechanical noise. I wanted to attempt to make this as organic and kind of unintrusive as possible. And so this ended up being the most human-like, least mechanical thing I could come up with, and it's still very mechanical. And so we have kind of that that struggle to recreate a very simple and intuitive human activity with this nice upholstered plush-like structure, which the design of it being you would come in through the back and stick this through, and it would come out of the little 3D or laser cut piece, and it would breathe in the back of your neck like this, to kind of stimulate that experience of kind of a very unique sensation that you usually don't have unless somebody's like coming up to you in real life and like breathing on the back of your neck, which would be weird. That this kind of experience that you only have in a very particular situation, but in a very mechanical way. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I felt like the exploration was successful in the sense, did you just smell it? In the sense that there were a lot of paradoxes presented with this structure that I think comment on the challenges of telepresence and kind of merging humanity and robotics. So first being true presence versus simulated presence. So how much of our personal associations do we project onto just a base, as we discussed before, a base diverse sensory experience? I feel like a user who might use this SpoonBot, every experience would be different, even though the sensory output of the robot is the same every time. Also sentimentality versus technology. Again, what memories and what associations do we ascribe to what is essentially a gear turning because an electric current is passing through a board? Also objective versus nostalgic experience. Do we know that we're experiencing something telepresently in an objective way, or are we projecting our past associations with that stimulus onto it? Mechanical intimacy, kind of the jarring disconnect between what this experience is trying to get at and the realities of bringing it to life, and how difficult it is to reach that point of naturalness with machine and the challenges that poses. And finally, the process as a metaphor for what this is trying to get at, the difficulty with which it proved to be to create, like I said before, breathing, which is so natural to us, but for a machine, it's incredibly difficult, and the force required to pull that syringe is so great, even though for us we take a breath and it's nothing. So, this is a video of the gear at work. This thing right here took years off my life. This is very difficult to do because the forces required to do this are huge. Because again, there's a vacuum. You can see that little gear struggling hard, but he's doing it, and so the air that comes out of there would be blown onto the back of the neck to kind of recreate that experience. But yeah, there's to calibrate the code to make sure that the length of time it was going each way was consistent. But yeah, that little gear was surprisingly difficult to do. But yeah.
There was learning how to do CAD modeling, learning how to do Arduino, learning how to do 3D printing,
Yeah, so I
learning
didn't
how
know-
to make, how to put something together.
Yeah,
I mean,
so-
there was so much that it looks very simple, but this is a big success as far as from where I'm standing, seeing the process.
Yeah, it was like I didn't know if I should mention it, but yeah, I've had zero experience with any of these things before. I've never 3D printed anything, laser cut anything, drilled a hole really before this, but I definitely think I've learned so much and come a long way, and I think I'm really happy with kind of the things I discovered along the way and exploring this concept as well as acquiring technical skills. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it.
Okay, so I have two that are both trying to get at the idea of touch, and sort of, as we were talking earlier this week, touch sort of comes down to two things. It's heat and vibration. Vibration being sort of a broader category in which things like texture, like feeling water motion gets at, but that idea of motion. So I have two objects, one of which is sort of getting at the idea of wearable tech, and it is a wristband that heats up depending on the ambient temperature. Actually, if you go to the next slide. So sort of the process coming about this was thinking about body heat and both like where do we tend to get cold and where do we come in contact with other people and feel their body heat. Good one after this. So also thinking about where on the body is sort of a pulse point where the blood is close to the skin and changes your body temperature most quickly, so that sort of a small isolated experience can have a greater full body effect. So getting at the inside of the wrist, because your veins are really close to the skin, it's easier to heat yourself up by putting heat or cold against that. So if you go to the next one. So thinking about where I can take these heating pads, which are sort of like a pre-created mesh, and where can those go on the body that both gets at where someone would touch you and is sort of a pleasant, full experience that sort of starts heating up your full body. So this wristband basically measures the ambient temperature, and if it's below a certain threshold, this wearable part of it will heat up. So you get to experience that idea of heat. And this is very much a prototype in the sense that it has to come with a lot of electronics and batteries to go along with it. But it does functionally work in terms of taking inputs and outputs and working along that threshold. And the second one is getting at the idea of vibration. And this one is more about two-way connection. Go to the next slide. Basically, the idea of this was wanting to think about, starting from the idea of footsie as like this sort of childish but like human contact sort of thing, and thinking about vibration and how you could communicate with your feet. So that was sort of came to then the idea of pressure sensors and having pressure sensors trigger vibration motors. The idea of this is actually to have two units in which two people could communicate with each other, but right now the two sides of it communicate with each other so that you can sort of test it yourself. If you press down on one side, the other side vibrates, and you press down on this side, the other side vibrates. So that's the idea of pressure to vibration as this idea of touch being somehow communicated. Go to the next slide. The formal language of this was a little more elaborate than this. I wanted to go with something in the way that this is very austere and very much feels like it's ripstop nylon. It's very harsh in some ways. I wanted this to be sort of the opposite. It's very sort of romantic and traditional. It is neon, it is still pink, it is covered in these like Art Deco designs that are very like romantic and sort of overly formal, and this idea of it's almost like a jewel box is getting this idea like it's precious connection, but it's also just sort of so much in contrast with the vibration motors, which while they feel cool are still a very mechanical sensation to us. Like nothing in our lives vibrates normally, like we're used to our phones, like electric massagers, like it's a very mechanical motion, so I wanted to sort of give a greater contrast to that. It also essentially looks like a luxury cat bed, which I kind of enjoy because that makes you think it's sort of something that feels less weird in a household situation, and this idea that it's not quite so mechanical, so getting at those touches.
Just so it's clear, the idea is that there would be two of these, right?
Yeah, the idea is that there would be two of these and your feet could communicate with someone else's feet. The reason that these two sides work that is so you can demonstrate that to yourself. And this is more meant to be demonstrated with your hands because it's a little weird to demonstrate it with your feet if you have a lot of people going through it.
Can you play with it?
I need to use Sarah's alligator clips, so not yet, but in like 20 minutes, yeah.
It will be on display tomorrow night too.
Yeah.
Do we need more alligator clips between now and then?
That
sounds like
I don't know.
we don't
It's
need
not
to share
good.
alligator clips.
But she made my pressure sensors because she's awesome, so that's why I've been sharing those bits. But you go to the next slide. So this is sort of what the inside matrix of this looks like. There's rows of vibration motors on each side, and then there's a neoprene pressure sensor that's about this big on each side. Yeah, so that's my two.
Alright, so I'll try to keep this relatively quick. I'll start off with an exercise, well, first a little preface. A lot of the things that I saw in the sort of beam style telepresence robots was that there are certain things that people are really good at, and one of those things is telling which other objects are people. And when you're trying to make a robot that looks like a person, you're kind of fighting against this because you have to convince a really good system. So I wanted to find something that we are really good at that I could have work with me. So I need one person to be the judge of this. Cool. All right, I need everyone else to close their eyes. Cool. And I want you to raise your hand, and when I count down from 3, I want you to point at where I am. All right, 3, 2, 1, go. And I'm going to walk around and talk, and I want you to keep pointing at where I am in the room. And Natalie, judge, are they really fairly accurate in their pointing?
Really good at it.
Yeah. So this is something that the human brain is really good at, is pinpointing where in 3D space a sound is coming from. And if you think about like how this is going on, really your ears only have, you know, 2 sensors which say this is exactly what the sound pressure is at this point in time, and from that input, from the differences in volume, from the differences in pressure between these, you can say, you know, create this really vivid soundscape. So my project is this thing doesn't actually work, but when you would put it on, the idea is that the 2 participants in this would both have a helmet like this. In the final version, it would not be wired, it would be wireless. And basically it just has little headphones and a camera on top. I'll explain its purpose in a second, but both participants put this on in their rooms at very far separate locations, and the room has the capability of detecting where each person is in their separate environment. And there's also a microphone on it. So when 2 people step into this room, they initiate a session, and then one person starts speaking, and when they speak, the room knows where they are, and it projects the sound into the other headphones, modulated so that it sounds like they're both in the same room. So when one person moves around, the other person hears them moving. It's like they're in the same location. This sort of aspect of being together is what I want to get at. The fact that you really don't need much to make it seem convincingly like someone is there. Like, we just closed our eyes right now and you can tell where that is. And this was partially inspired by a demo on YouTube I put headphones on and listened to in high school, where it sounds like there's a barber going around and cutting your hair, and it was, I don't know, it was cool and fun, and I thought, I don't really have an Oculus Rift, but maybe I can do sort of something like that with sound. So what you'd actually get is, like I said, the 2 headsets, and then, so the problems here are essentially, how do you generate sound such that it sounds like it's coming from somewhere, and how do you detect where someone is in a room? And it turns out that, unfortunately for my project, these are both absurdly difficult problems. And so we'll start with detecting where someone is in a room. So the way I started thinking about this at first was like, oh, they're at a location and they need to find out where they are. So my initial solution was to put a row of depth sensors along one of the walls, and then, you know, most of the outputs from them will just be the distance across the room, but a couple of them, if you're in the room, will be a bit closer. And from the location along the wall that you get the closer readings and how close the reading is, you can find their position. But the problem is you need more than that. You also need their orientation, because, you know, if I spin around, the sound is now coming from different places. So Michael Ibben actually put me onto the idea of, it's called fiducial marker systems. Really what this means is you have something like this, yeah, that'd be great, along the ceiling of a room. And these are pretty little pictures that are easy for computers to read. And so each one of these has a specific location, and the system knows that, and this will be on the ceiling, hence the upward-facing camera on the hat. So using this input, the room can localize you in 3D space, including your position and your orientation, and the system itself will take this in and use it to generate the appropriate sound output. So how do you actually make sound that sounds like it's coming from somewhere? Well, this is actually something that, weirdly enough, not many people have put huge amounts of thought into. It's kind of frustrating. So it's easy to think about placing sound based on volume differences. Obviously, if I'm facing this way, a sound coming from here will sound louder in this ear and quieter in this ear, both because this one is farther away and because my head is in the way. And also, the sound will be slightly delayed. But there's a lot more going on here. You'll notice if you cover up one ear, you can still do the pointing demo and find out where I am. So it's not just that there's differences in the ears, it's the fact that, you know, your head has specific sound properties. It transmits certain frequencies of sound, and it reflects certain frequencies of sound, and so does everything else in your environment, your hands, your body, the pinna on your ear specifically. So it's with the really minute characteristics of how that system works and affects sound waves that lets your brain determine from where the sound is located. It knows that, you know, if I'm here, the higher frequencies get dimmed because they have to pass through the pinna first. If I'm here, they get preserved more because there's just air between them. If a sound is behind my head, it sounds lower because it has to propagate through all the squishy stuff inside your brain. So this specific property is called a head-related transfer function, and there's a bunch of libraries that ostend to do this. They don't. Essentially, it's a really difficult task, and I have a demo, but it doesn't work very well, so I'm not gonna plug it in tomorrow and you can play with it, but that's what I wanted to do. And ideally it would have been great and you would have just put them on and felt like you were totally having a conversation with someone millions of miles away, but I still think it's a good idea.
So should we talk about dig back into kind of all the
Just
projects?
quickly
and-
double checking, wasn't there one more group member?
Yeah, and she's not
Okay,
here right
all right.
now. And tomorrow we'll have a chance to kind of test these out and really kind of get to immerse ourselves in the experience. But first of all, I just want to comment on the kind of diversity of ideas, and like I think that this was the group that Michael and I were wondering the most about, and like in the sense that we were seeing how all these things were going to come together. And I just have to say, I'm not speaking for you, but I'm really pleased with what you guys have done in terms of taking each individual problems and trying to find solutions to them. So there was a little more at risk here because you were kind of a little bit more out on a limb, I think, and there was a lot more in terms of the technical resources you needed to find and so forth. But I think without exception, I think all four of you have done a great job of being able to kind of navigate that. I think that there's always more further that we can take these things with all the projects, but I just want to kind of start off with that. Would you add anything to that, or?
Yeah, no, I think everybody did a really great job. I think that one of the things that was really eye-opening for me is really breaking down these different senses and say, wow, there's so many sources of information that could be transmitted, and to actually dive into some of them I thought was really cool. I really liked how in Isaac's, there's a fundamental asymmetry in telepresence robots where there's a driver and then there's the people on the other side, and they don't see each other the same way. They're not in each other's space. And so one of the cool things about Isaac's idea is that you really would be in a shared space. There'd be a symmetry between the two people. So I would feel you in my space and you would feel me in your space. And I think that's really neat.
I think that this group, perhaps maybe more than others or just differently than others, have really expanded what telepresence can be. I mean, I think that that's really valuable to kind of think about telepresence as touch, or the kind of intimacy at a distance, and really exploring these things in a rich way. Aside from the technical challenges, which you guys all were able to kind of navigate and find solutions to, the way you framed the problems conceptually, I think, was really well done. So maybe we just open it up to everybody. I mean, what are your comments? What are your thoughts? Yeah.
I really like the parts in this where the machine components have like unexpected personality. I think that this still has some like residual laser cut smell, which is like really interesting to me because it's like halitosis, like machine bred halitosis, which is like something that you would totally. And I was actually really, when you talked about the wearing fan thing, I pictured for a second what this project would look like if you had like a massive 3-foot diameter air compressor with like a foot of like sound insulating foam and like, but just to have this like one little laser cut halitosis air breath on the back of your neck, and I feel like that would be like such an interesting experience to sit behind. And I think that this, does do a pretty good job of communicating that, even though it's like, there's a lot of obstacles in the way. And I thought that was really cool. I was also really interested in like applications for your thing and how it could. I feel like it's really interesting for one-to-one interaction, but also like many-to-many interaction or different things because of the timing and how that has its personality to it.
So one comment I wanted to make that sort of goes for all four of you, I think, and that is the ones that seem to have the most promise and maybe be the most successful directions to go in are the ones where it is maybe less about a machine doing something versus having somebody at a distance doing something. So like the breathing one, I think would be really cool, but I'd almost want it to be if, it's representing somebody else's breathing rather than a machine or a simulation. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that's important about all the technology here is it's kind of like telephones. After a while, drop phone calls on cell phones and the lousy audio is a problem. But really, I ignore that and I hear what the person on the other end is saying. And with all the things that you're coming up with, I can see a point being reached where we start to ignore the technology and the limited bandwidth that we might have for some of this stuff and start to actually feel the presence of the other person. I think all of these could do that really well. And, I would experiment with a fan actually for yours, just because it's not that different than snoring in a way. So, there are sounds associated with breathing anyway, and even if it's not the same, it might translate effectively. But I think all these ideas could work really well. So I'm really interested to see how you take them to the next level to get it to the point where we can ignore the technology and just see the other person in the room or hear them.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I don't know if you all worked individually because you didn't get along well as a group, or whether you just, decided to divide it up. I know about group projects. It's irrelevant, though. At
This
point.
group actually did, I think, just as a kind of commentary, I think that you guys really worked well individually, but you also really worked well together. And I think you kind of riffed off one another, especially in the early phases of kind of the need-finding phase. Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting to think if you had time to move forward, would there be a coming back together? Because it seemed like you worked very well in the framing of it.
Yeah.
It seemed like there's a lot of agreement on that. So kind of what might this be, whether it's an installation where they exist separately but in the same space, or whether it's actually some object that somehow combines them all. The other thing I thought as you were talking, these are all sort of very warm, fuzzy, some literally fuzzy, sort of remote sensing, or you had such good words there. So my devil's advocate in me thought, okay, what about if it wasn't about the warm fuzzy part, but is this a way to have surveillance, and I use that term very broadly, in a more acceptable way? So the first time I thought of it was this, where could it be as a parent, instead of having a baby monitor in the baby's room, for example, that you actually have this thing which shows that the baby's actually lying. You could see their outline on the mat on the bed, right? I don't know what these other ones would become, but is there a way that, so that's not, we don't think of it as surveillance with your baby, but it really is on some level. So anyway, I just was going to throw that out there. Are there ways that it could be, yes, about communicating, like intentional, I'm walking on this, or I put my feet in the massage thing, or I speak in this three-dimensional virtual space. But is there another application which would make some forms of surveillance more acceptable? And whether that's good or not, I don't know, because just as your project, it's questioning, these are approximations, and what does that mean, right? What does the approximation, the mechanical approximation mean as far as our own human interaction? Yeah, this one I thought was very interesting. I just want to say the design of it. I read that as the Alhambra. I know it's not direct.
Yeah.
So then when you start talking about feet, I just was like, whoa, feet, Alhambra, Islam. So
The
just
direct formal thing, and it's maybe if you see these, is from old-fashioned radios. It's like a very direct translation. I have pictures; they're not on this slideshow
Right.
though.
These things
But
are so
yeah,
often.
totally. That is not a good unconscious association. So
So I
certainly
think you
issues.
have a lot of fun with like
Yeah.
what that housing
Yeah.
might be.
I also got arabesque, but I loved it. Especially the fact that I can see the text on the other side.
Yeah. So
And
step
it's like,
inside.
to me, yeah, I liked viewing it from behind because, no offense, it's great from front too. But I thought it was cool to like peek to see the text on the other side, like through this arabesque filter, and like, I don't know, it's hard for me to place my finger on what attracts it to me, but I think it's kind of like the machine having it, the laser cutter having its voice on the work, which I thought was interesting.
This was like the first thing I ever laser cut or bent, so that was sort of just an exploration of figuring out the technical aspect. But I also liked that it was transparent, and that because, I don't know, for me in particular, I felt like even in trying to recreate like platonic actions, there's always some sort of intimate or sexual implication. And particularly with this, it is voyeuristic. There's something about telepresence that is inherently voyeuristic, and the idea of transparency and you can see the pieces also sort of played to that idea of you can see what's going on. You're peeking into someone else's world. And what you were saying about surveillance is actually a big part of what we talked about originally conceptually, is thinking about access and how much telepresence is really problematic when it comes to access, because the capacities of a robot to see you, to hear you, to perceive you, to record you work on a different set of assumptions than human presence. We know how to prevent a human from coming in, to prevent a human from having some sort of access to us that we don't consent to. But with a robot, a lot of those boundaries can be transgressed in a way that you don't necessarily know about or that you don't initially realize until later. And that sort of was a big problem. So we were both coming from the idea of, because our user research was about like very intentional long distance relationships, like with your parents, with your friends, with romantic partners, what is that intentional communication? But I think part of what this was getting at is like, what are the parts of it that are uncomfortable? Can someone always see you when you're walking on the rug, and do you always want them to? Like, what information do you transmit that you don't realize you're transmitting? And how does sort of privacy play into this? And I think a lot of these inputs certainly would work well for surveillance. This one, I mean, just is working on ambient temperature, but heat sensors are very small, simple, and easy to use, and that's a great way to tell where humans are or did perceive motion if you had a bunch of them. The same with the pressure sensors that you were using and that you helped me use to get at where people are without them knowing. You could easily have a floor that's covered in pressure sensors that is telling where all of us are and not know about it. So that sense of when are you being told that you're transmitting information is a really interesting problem.
I was thinking too, just briefly, because I know we're short on time, but the heat sensors,
Yeah.
it would be interesting if they could come on in a pattern.
Yeah.
So like I'm patting
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael on the back, which would be different than if I gave him a big hug,
Yeah.
right? And what kind of hug? Is it sort of like this or a big
Yeah.
hug? So it would be interesting if there's some way that those heat reenactment pods sort
Yeah.
of come on or off in a way that simulates that level of intimacy.
Yeah, getting a range rather than just a like on-off input.
Right.
Absolutely. And that was sort of like my initial prototype, and then the second one, which has a slightly more complex, like more than one input, more than one output, was sort of step 2. But I think that idea of getting ranges of things and more levels of feedback is really important to getting more at.
I also want to just briefly comment on your process a little bit, which I think that these are both very successful, both conceptually and technically, as we've talked about. You haven't had a lot of experience working with making things or kind of the Arduino stuff, and there was a big hump trying to get the heating pads to work. And I mean, there was a lot of time and frustration spent on that. But you had these really great ideas, and you had really been, the whole group had been thinking very deeply about, what telepresence actually means. And I think once you were able to get over that technical hump and you felt a little more comfortable with the Arduino, not only were you able to kind of refine this to a point where I think you have a really nice prototype, but you took it even a step further and you made a second one that this came about within the last couple weeks, I think,
I think I spent like a month, maybe a month and a half trying to make power happen.
Yeah,
And
just
then
very
all of a
simple
sudden
thing.
last night I realized that like for the box one that it wasn't necessary, that it could run enough off of 5 volts with a different setup.
But I just want to point out that I think both are great, but I also think something really special is happening with the footsie thing, for lack of a better term. I think in terms
the masturbatory footsie robots.
that works too. Both in terms of the formal language, in terms of the technical, just getting the thing to kind of work the way you want it to work, and the questions you're asking with the telepresence. And I just want to point out that came kind of towards the end, and it was after those kind of initial frustrations that you're able to kind of feel comfortable with it that you started to crank out these really interesting objects. So it's worth kind of reflecting a little bit on the process and just kind of how you got here with 2 really, what I see as very successful projects. And I think this is applicable to all the projects, and I think, we could certainly say some of the same things about kind of some of the conversations we had with just getting this thing to kind of work in the way that we wanted to work. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that the frustrations, but then how you guys were able to navigate around those frustrations and be able to come up with something where you really pushed the idea and developed it quite far. And I think now you're at a point where you could take it even further if you wanted to with other kinds of projects. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that. I think that there's I think that for me, that's the real success of these projects.
What I think is cool is how, and I don't know if it's because we hogged all the yellow acrylic, but how there's like this black and pink theme throughout it, even with coincidentally with the carpet and with the hat, with everything. And I kind of was imagining these all like little products that you guys as a company could offer, this Tele-Intimacy thing. And you think about all the relationships I've had, for example, my dad at work, me at work. This reminds me of something you'd sit at the nail place and like put your feet in, and you could keep it under your desk, and it's not shady because you can see into it, and like you could just like kick someone under the table, and also having like a carpet where you can like, or like a couch where you could come home, sit on the couch, the other person can sit on the couch, and the concept of when they get up, they don't leave it immediately, it still lingers. I really actually like that a lot. When you said it appears right away and then kind of disappears, that's kind of how it is when you like see someone. They're there and then say goodbye and it still kind of lingers. It's not as abrupt as like ending a Skype call and then they're gone, which I really never liked about having that with long distance. So I was just excited because there's kind of something for everyone, including this. Like at the end of the day, this is kind of the weirdest one in a good way, but it's like in the privacy of your own home. You know, you're not going to bring this to the office. You could totally bring that. You could totally bring the wrist guards. It's like a nice range of things.
I almost want to see just one object. I mean, I think if we had like another 2 weeks or something, it would be interesting to kind of see what another iteration of this would be with like.
Just like a
Yeah. A spooning, vibrating footsie, heating.
Well, the couch one in particular, because I feel like what I'm imagining with Isaac thing is the idea that you can hear that someone's on to the side of you, and they can hear that you're on the side of them, and if you can also see their sort of warm, butt print next to you, that's and be footsying each other. Yeah, that there's this whole web of interconnections. It's really beautiful.
It was originally conceived of as like a bunch of like sort of conceptual misfit toys, but like I think it was always coming from the idea that we're pulling telepresence apart, so to put it back together.
Yeah.
Like the team member who couldn't be here is working on a belly that like expands and contracts, that sort of goes with this idea of like a spooning couch, that you have like chest or stomach moving against your back, you have air, you might have heat, you might have sort of this like memory of heat and color, so you have a visual thing, you have an auditory thing, so sort of getting a lot of these senses. We also wanted to play with olfactory stuff, but that was sort of technically not something we could accomplish in this time period. But yeah, I really like the idea that these could all come together because it's sort of like all the bits of telepresence in a non-speech way.
I'd like to revisit all this tomorrow evening, because I think that once we get all these kind of working kind of in the space, it'll be nice to kind of really experience it and have a little more of a conversation about that. But really, really nice work, guys.
So our group is really interested in how telepresence could sort of be expanded beyond sort of the Skype paradigm of there's video feed, which is sort of camera of the head and shoulders, and sort of spoken word dialogue that's very intentional and conversational, and it's that symmetric two-way dialogue between those two people. We were interested in sort of thinking about how the sort of human experience of presence is a lot more than just that sort of vision of another person and intentional speech, how there is heat, there is motion, there is smell, there is other sensations of being in the same space with a person, and thinking about how electronics could get at those other sensory experiences that would sort of, as a complement to the other projects people were working on in terms of navigation, in terms of video, in terms of mobility and interacting with the space, that would sort of complement those to fully round out the experience of telepresence and get at more of those sort of primitive experiences of presence. So ours explored touch and other senses.
Yeah, and I think through doing those things, we wanted to kind of also explore the idea of telepresence as it is, and as Emma said, kind of using those senses that we're not really used to being transmitted remotely, and seeing how that transmission can maybe evoke within people associations or other nostalgic projections that they might have with those same stimuli that, like, had that been in a room with a real person, would have a different context than when a machine would be doing it. So initially when we started our user research, we asked a lot of questions of people who are in long-distance relationships, not necessarily romantic ones. We asked about relationships that persist when we go to college with our family, with our friends, and also with romantic partners, and how beyond Skype and beyond a voice and a face on a screen, we can still feel present with someone even though they're not there, and kind of exploring whether that presence is real and how it's different from true human presence. So we kind of took that idea and we all branched off and we tried to isolate individual expressions of human intimacy in small artifacts. A lot of us in this group didn't really have a lot of technical experience before this, so it was both an exploration of the concept and also of kind of the difference between some gestures that are very natural and human and the kind of arduous work it takes to bring that to life through machinery, and how difficult it can be to translate humanity into gears and electricity and sensors. So I guess we can just go down the line.
Talk about individual projects. So I was interested in touch and sort of breaking down touch into component parts. The two that I sort of focused on were thinking about that touch is mostly about heat and vibration. So, and those are also two things that very simple, sort of primitive Arduino robotics could replicate. This is basically just a wristband that can be worn that, depending on, in this case, the ambient temperature here, but could be the ambient temperature of somewhere else or some sort of transmitted input, warms up. So you can sort of have that experience of heat. And I chose the inner wrist because both that is somewhere that someone might touch you in an affectionate way, and because your veins are really close to the skin on the insides of your wrist, it heats up the rest of your body more quickly, so it starts to evoke more of a full body experience, even though it's a very small trigger. But again, that's sort of getting at this idea of how can we use mechanics to trigger and evoke an emotional memory or experience or association, so that that projection fleshes out that sense of someone is sending me something, someone is communicating with me, someone is present. This is getting at the idea of vibration. It was inspired by sort of the idea of footsie. There are two sides of it, though it's meant to be a prototype for, yeah. It's meant to prototype two separate units that could be in different places, in which one, there are pressure sensors that take in pressure and causes the other one to vibrate, and this one you could communicate between two hands or 2 feet, but that way you guys could understand sort of what's going on there. But getting at this idea of vibration as the other component part of touch, I'm thinking about pressure as another human form of touch that we really recognize the contact from someone else. And there's also sort of a formal interest here in terms of going with something that's very black, nylon wires, austerity, sort of get this idea of how much can the emotional association take you if you close your eyes and try to imagine someone is sending you this. Does it get towards a human experience, or is it too technical to feel at all human? And this was sort of putting an interesting covering on something that is still very technical and austere, and vibration in a simulated experience being so technical. There's nothing in our lives that really vibrates in the same way that motors do, other than our cell phones, which maybe do feel human and natural to us now. But coming with a cover that was both, it's got a lot of Art Deco designs that feel very like overly romantic. It's also kind of like a luxury cat bed, so something that feels household, and also the idea of a jewel box to think about. It's containing precious connection. So playing with those tensions. Yeah. So, I mean, it's pretty subtle. Like, it is vibrating right now. You can maybe hear it, but you guys can come play with it later. But the two sides communicate with each other.
So my project sought to kind of, in a mechanical way, attempt to recreate the experience of being spooned. So I think I've actually dubbed this guy the spoon bot. So basically this is an upholstered structure that's meant to be lain on. And it's pink thermal fleece. So it has an aesthetic of like almost a plush animal. It's very soft. And then this part here is the long and arduous journey of trying to recreate human breath. Because what this is supposed to be is this goes into the back of this, there's a hole, and it comes out through the front, and this syringe pumps like rhythmically, and it creates short bursts of air to the back of the neck, which is, I think, a very unique sensory experience that doesn't usually happen in life unless you are being spooned, unless someone is like coming up behind you and breathing on your neck, which is weird. So this is kind of what, this is like the mechanical version of lungs. And this process was extremely difficult because among all of the avenues I had considered of recreating human breath, there was a fan, which would have been very loud and completely kind of take somebody out of the suspension of disbelief necessary to kind of project associations onto this. So I tried to go with something I thought would be more silent, like a syringe. The problem with that became that a vacuum is created every time the syringe is pumped, making, when this gear is turned on and it kind of goes back and forward, it almost seems like the machine is like breathing in a labored way. So I think that was really indicative of kind of the juxtaposition between this very human soft object and then this like mess of gears and wires and like this pulling like of this syringe with a vacuum inside of it, and how for a machine that process of breathing is so much more difficult than like for a human being. We just take a breath and we don't even think about it. So so I think another thing I was trying to get at with this piece is kind of, I don't know if you guys have experienced this when you're on Skype or when you're talking to a friend or a family member and you're having this conversation and you feel so present and there with them in the room, and then the conversation is over and you realize that you're just sitting alone in your room in front of a metal box, like in front of a computer. So that was kind of the idea I was trying to get at with this piece. You know, you lie in front of it and you're reminded very much of this experience that you have your own associations with and that is very much human, but then you realize you're like lying on a weird fleece thing maybe on the floor and like there's a gear behind you. So that was kind of the idea that I was getting at with this. But yeah, the spoon butt.
This hat here. It's a camera on top. We'll get to what exactly is going on in a moment, but to introduce this idea, I want to do a demonstration, and can I have 2 volunteers, potentially? Yeah, Dan. And, yeah, come here. All right, these wires. That was cool. All right, so I want you to stand here, and just stand facing them. Cool. So, when I went about trying to think about, about a project that I want to do for this class, I looked at other things that people were doing, like trying to make the BeamBot, more like a person, and I thought about the different systems that we as people have for interacting with our environment. And our visual systems are very acute to the sense that we can tell very accurately whether a certain object is a person or not, and objects that come very close to being people but are not people, we can still distinguish that, and in fact it's even creepier when they're almost there but not quite. So it kind of feels like as we try to humanize robots in that way, we're fighting against the fact that people are so good at this. So I wanted to think of something I could do that would work with a human system, something that we're very good at, something that is innate, and something that contributes a lot to how we interpret our environment. So I want you two guys to close your eyes. I'll stay over here. All right, and so I want you to point towards me. Keep your eyes closed. All right, and I want you to keep pointing towards me as I move around. So as I move my voice, they can tell where I am just because of the fact that I am speaking. And you can see them, they're relatively accurate. This is in fact where I am. So the human audio system is very good, you guys are good, at positioning, you can go. So the point of that was the human audio system is very good at positioning sound in 3D space. So I wanted to envision, one of the parts of having a conversation with someone, if they're right by you, is you know where they are. Even if you aren't looking at them, you can hear the sound coming from over there, and you feel together with them because of this. And so I wanted to imagine, say, a pair of rooms, at a distance very far away from each other. 2 people walk, like one person walks into each of their rooms, and this initiates like a session. It turns the rooms on. And so each of them in their own respective rooms, when they talk, I wanted it to be so that it sounds like the other person is in the room with them. I wanted it to sound like they're there together. So how do you do this? Your ears, right here where they're hearing, are really only picking up vibrations from 2 points in space, and from that you can reconstruct this 3D appearance. So all I needed was, a pair of headphones that could play the right sounds, and some way to tell where each person was in their rooms. So that came down to 2 challenges I had to solve, which were, where is the person, and how do I make sound that sounds like it's coming from somewhere? So I introduced this, which is not like a time travel helmet. It is ostensibly this, system. I actually forgot my headphones, but imagine they're headphones. So when I was going about solving this localization problem, I was going with a couple solutions, and can you pass me the no, not the fork is cool too, but the big white piece of paper? Yeah. So I thought of a couple systems, and most of them were, it's kind of sketchy, and then Michael actually put me onto this concept where you have a camera facing upwards, and then something like this, which you would put on the ceiling of your room. These are sort of markers that are very machine readable, and each of them would encode something about the location of where you are. So as the camera points up, it can tell not only where you are in the room, but from the orientation of what it's reading, which way you're facing. The second problem is how do you generate sound so that it sounds like it's coming from somewhere around you. So there's a lot of different cues your ears use, among them the volume difference between the ears, the difference in timing. But these changes that sound undergoes as it passes through the environment around your head are called a head-related transfer function. This is a field of audio engineering, and there exist libraries that do something like this. So all I would need to do is, throw something like that on the ceiling, pipe the system the appropriate transfer functions for each person's head, and then voila. It sounds to them as if they're there together. And I liked this idea because it seems like it's just enough information for you to really believe something. We hear someone's voice on the phone and we don't doubt their humanity, but if they come, up to you as a face on a robot, it's a bit creepier. I wanted it to be intimate, kind of in the way that the, more subtle telepresence things are, but also a mode of communication, also, a more concrete example of people kind of being there together. So yeah, I have a demo, but I forgot my headphones. That's my thing. What? Oh, I also forgot my computer. But
So I have 2 projects as well, and the first one was an exploration of telepresence with the idea that maybe a familiar object or the associations with a certain object could increase the physical presence of data. So I took the idea of like a can phone that you maybe used like as a kid to talk to a friend, and connected it to using a contact microphone, connected a can and to an audio jack, and now you can listen to music or Skype someone. And probably not too safe to plug it into your own phones, but I have it plugged into my computer right now, and I'll have music playing. And one thing I didn't anticipate was that I guess the connection needs to be grounded. So this is like a button with I have like conductive thread. You can press that to ground the connection, but it's actually better if you press the actual audio jack to do that. And so that was my first project. My second project was initially inspired by something I had already made previous to this class, which was this system wherein light photosensitive resistors are connected to a grid of LEDs, and just using that like one-to-one, there's like a sort of screen that's created, and so instead of using like light and more light, I wanted to see what would happen if you could have an input be pressure and have the output be heat. I guess the idea was that perhaps like if there was a large rug of pressure sensors, and I guess this is like Emma's, that it would be a pair of two of these rugs, and there's pressure sensors, and then another rug with thermochromic fabric that changes upon like temperature, so like when it's heated up it changes, and if there was a matrix underneath the fabric of heating coils, that the pressure sensors would trigger the specific heating coils, and then or like you could see potentially where that person was walking on the rug. So I guess in terms of like long distance relationships, that could be fun. So it sort of parsed down to what we have here, which is 4 pressure sensors and 4 conductive patches that heat up when the pressure sensors are pressed. Yeah, I can move my computer, but so I can hold this up. If you look closely, it's going to be gradual, but this one is actually changing color right now. As well as this. This is a problem with like the circuitry. But yeah, so that one's heating up.
So we can imagine like if you're standing on one in one place, there'd be like a footprint appearing on the other place.
Yeah. If this was a much bigger matrix. Yeah. I'm gonna unplug this though so it doesn't burn the neoprene.
Awesome. All right. Here.
So can I just like say some final things about
Yeah,
it?
that'd be great.
But yeah, so basically all of these little artifacts, some of them might be extrapolated into like a product made for the market, some of them are kind of more artistic conceptual explorations, some of them are playing with tech, but basically we're just trying to explore the idea of what is telepresence, how can that be expanded beyond what we kind of know telepresence to currently be, and how might some of these artifacts produce second iterations that might either go to market or maybe be presented in some kind of museum or display or together to spark conversations about telepresence and how its future and how that can be evolved. Yeah, thank you guys.